we are very honored to have the opportunity to welcome Mrs. Ruth Vecht to speak to us. I have to say she was extremely gracious when I got in touch with her, and appreciate that as well. Tisha B'Av is never the most buoyant occasion for getting out and about, and has been very warm today, although Mrs. Vecht said to me it was much hotter yesterday. Don't say it's hot today, it was hot yesterday. Today is very nice, absolutely right. So I would like to start on a joyful note to wish Mrs. Vecht Mazel Tov on the arrival of 4 great-grandchildren in Israel in the last 12 days. Wow. The most remarkable, I don't know if I can say it's an achievement on her part, but still it's something that we can say, may we please God one fine day in the future also be able to celebrate such an occasion. And I'm not going to ask her how many great-grandchildren she has, but I'm sure she doesn't want to disclose that number, but Mazel Tov on the latest and greatest arrivals.
Any twins or triplets?
Not sure, I don't know. It says in the book of Eicha we read last night, Kara alai moed. The context really is that the enemy summoned his minions and forces against the Jewish people. But the Talmud interprets that turn of phrase in a completely different way. Kara alai moed, that Tisha B'Av is called a moed. And the word moed usually means a festival. And in a certain sense, Tisha B'Av is treated as a festival, albeit only in a very limited way. But I heard from the late great Rav Moshe Shapiro many years ago that the word moed, which is usually or frequently rendered a festival or an appointed time, means a place of gathering. On the Moadim, we convene with God in the Beis Hamikdash in antiquity. But the word moed means a place of gathering or a time of gathering. The word va'ad means a committee coming together. But it's also related to the word mu'ad. Mu'ad, without going into a lot of Bava Kama today, mu'ad refers to a phenomenon which is anticipated, which is sort of like a pattern has been established, a shor ha-mu'ad, which again, I'm not going into details of that. The reason I mention it is that he said, Rav Moshe Shapiro said about Tisha B'Av, that the word moed means also direction or destiny, like the word yi'ud, which means destiny. A moed is also a destination. Tisha B'Av is a destination in the sense that it points towards our destiny. On Tisha B'Av, we recall the exile and we anticipate the redemption. It is from the perspective or from recalling the Churban that we have the certainty of the redemption. And the reason I dwell on this topic a little bit is that when I asked Mrs. Vecht, will she share with us her Holocaust testimony, she said she's happy to do so, and she mentioned that her experience, as we'll hear from her, I don't need to tell you about it, as we'll hear from her, is in many ways more benign than that of her contemporaries in the European continent, and hers is a hopeful account, one that reflects the human potential for decency, for humanity, and that is such a hopeful and a refreshing thought and account to consider. And that's why I say that Tisha B'Av is when we recall the darkest days of Jewish history, but by that same token, it contains within a prescription for better days. And with that brief introduction, it gives me great pleasure and honor to call on Mrs. Ruth Vecht to share with us her experiences during the darkest days for Jews of the 20th century, and a tale of hope and the human potential for decency as well. Please.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. Right, I'm there. Thank you for that very sweet introduction. There's a lot of truth in it,
I feel, especially now when we all feel it's the darkest days, we're all consumed with concern for what's going on in Israel. We're all worried. Even our need for drink almost subsides in the background when you think about what's going on in Israel. And we can't see a way out. And in a way, I'm glad to tell you a story that's slightly different. I feel a little bit like a museum piece because I was there when it happened and I'm still here. You know, I should be dusted down, but still. The reason why the Danish Jews are reluctant to tell their story is because when all of the Holocaust was so terrible and so many people were being murdered, or waiting, God forbid, but they were waiting to be murdered, the Danish story is different. So we feel a bit embarrassed about actually telling the story because it's like somebody rich showing off to somebody poor. And there are many, one can give many reasons why the Danes were the way they were, but basically they were actually, if not in sort of daily lives, terribly Christian, and you can talk about their sexual morality or something, which might not be the Golders Green one, but they internalized a Christianity, a love of human beings, and a respect and an awe of God. And I think that's what actually stopped them from joining into the barbarity of the Germans. You've all heard stories about the king of Denmark who put on a yellow star. It isn't true, okay? It never happened. But there was a truth in it in the sense that the king at some stage had said that if anybody of his people was going to be singled out and wear a yellow star, then he and everyone else would be doing the same. So there was a way of not actually segregating people by this. And I can do it in two bits. I'll tell the story about my parents and then how it fits into the world picture. So my parents were Orthodox Jews from Frankfurt am Main. Both of them were part of the community there of the what was called the Austrittsgemeinde, which is more or less like monks, or rather it's the monks is a succession, yeah, it's a follow-up after that. And they were Orthodox. They lived in Berlin. They were also very broad. They were politically interested, certainly culturally interested. There was music, there was literature, there was everything you can think of, and orthodoxy at the same time. So my parents were politically aware, and my father had read Mein Kampf quite early on, actually, and he had realized that whatever Hitler said, he actually meant. He meant that, and here was a wonderful cultural Germany, and here was a man with completely barbaric ideas. And my father took note. And then, you know the history of the First World War and the Versailles Treaty and how it all came about, that the Germans felt really badly done by because they'd lost the First World War and they felt they'd been cheated in many ways, and they looked around for scapegoats. And voila, the Jews appeared. And they were very soon, in a way, there was something in what they were saying. They said the Jews were everywhere. If you think of the very minute number of Jews there are in the world and how they've got influence everywhere, there was something about it, in the sense that they, to a large extent, certainly in Germany, they ran the newspapers, there was a lot of literature, it was films, it was books, it was music, it was theatre, the media. They seem to be everywhere and quite disproportionate to their actual numbers. Nonetheless, when Hitler came to power at the end of March 1933, my parents, who lived a very comfortable life, decided this was no place for Jewish people to stay, and certainly not a place for Jewish children to be brought up. My mother stood on the balcony and she saw the stormtroopers marching past and singing, "Wenn Judenblut vom Messer spritzt, dann geht's noch mal so gut," which means when Jewish blood sprouts from the knife, then everything is twice as good. And in a way, you hear echoes of that sort of feeling nowadays, and you think, are we seeing the same thing again? Anyhow, when Hitler came to power, my father said to my mother, he phoned her on a Friday and he said, if you get permission from the police to go, we're leaving today. Friday, she goes to the police. She says to that you had to get a visa or something to leave. She says to the policeman, they want to go on holiday in Denmark. So the policeman looked at her and said, are you Jewish? And she said, yeah. So he sat down and wrote out a sign for them to leave that day. So they lived a very comfortable life. They had maids. My father drove to work in a Mercedes. My mother never did a stroke of work. It was, my grandmother wouldn't go out with my mother when the Kindermädchen was on holiday or when it was her day off, because then my mother could be seen pushing her own pram. This was the level. Quite mad. Okay. So they closed the flat. They sent the maids away. They took 2 suitcases, took their papers, took a taxi to the station, took the train to Denmark, were Machal Shabbos, and never came back. And they arrived in Denmark, and in Denmark they were not allowed to work. My father was not allowed to work. He was an estate agent, but only for city property, and Denmark is a very small country, and it doesn't need lots and lots of people coming in. So he wasn't allowed to work for 5 years. And being a Jekke, he didn't. So they crowded into a non-Jewish boarding house and lived on fish and vegetables, 4 of them in one room, and they stayed there. And people would come from Germany, their friends and relatives would come. This was the early 30s. They would come from Germany and sing, but Alice, when I see how you are living, all you still need is a goat in the room. I mean, what are you doing? And I think of my beautiful flat in Frankfurt, in Berlin, in Paris, or wherever they were coming from. And my mother would say, get out while you can. Get out now while you can. And they went back to their flats. And that was that. And so when I was 4, so I'll just give you a timeline, otherwise you'll get lost. I was born in 36. And so when I was 4, the Germans invaded Denmark. And I came into my mother, and she was crying in bed. And I said, she was jolly, normally very jolly. I said, why are you crying? She said, the Germans had come. Now, from her point of view, she'd now been a refugee for 7 years. And here were the Germans again. I said, what does it mean? She said, they don't like Jews. Okay, I was 4, not politically aware. And then I fast forward to 1942. And this time I came into my parents and they were sitting in the living room, which was blue with smoke. My father smoked approximately 40 Abdullahs, I think they were, a day. And there was this blue fog. And my mother was screaming. She was screaming. What was she screaming? She was screaming, I wish he were dead. I wish he were dead. It would be better for him. And I was 6 years old and I stood there and I thought, it was better if he was dead. What's she talking about? This is her favorite brother, Julius. What does she mean it's better if he's dead? But somehow I worked out that the Germans were really very dangerous. And then I started looking at people. And then I started looking at noses. My father's nose was definitely Jewish. It was long, it was spent and slim. And Danish noses were also big, but I kept on looking. They were bigger and they were spread over more of the face. Surely the Germans could see that he was Jewish. And then they would take him away and send him off like Julius. So I was really worried. And then I made it my job to walk up and down outside the house and pretend that I was that I was a soldier. Because somehow I worked out that it was important to keep the grown-ups happy. They had worked out it was important to keep the children happy. So we were both playing this game. And I walked up and down and pretended to be a soldier, but really I was waiting for my father to come round the corner. And when I saw him, I thought, oh, thank God, I can stop playing this idiotic game, okay? And then, now, the Germans had occupied the country, but the Danes made sure that the Jews were left in peace. And everything went on more or less as it had gone on till that time. Denmark, there were good reasons for this. Denmark, I don't know whether you've got a map in your head, but Denmark is a small peninsula on top of Germany with lots of little islands dotted around. It was an agricultural country, and it grew lots of things that you know about: butter, eggs, bacon, whatever comes that way, cheese. And Germany expected the Danes to be their larder. As time went on, the Danes grew more and more irritated with the Germans, and sabotage became more and more common. And at one stage, in August 43, it was enough, and the Danes had to abdicate, so to speak, and the German became the military government of Denmark. Now, the Jews had been safe all this time, and they were completely convinced that they were going to carry on being safe. They could not envisage, there was no way they could envisage that anything was happening to them, because they were Danish Jews. In fact, my mother had been phoned up when when the Germans invaded Denmark, and said, "Oh, Mrs. B, I'm thinking so much about you." But she had never realized that being Jewish was the bit that connected them. She was Danish and Jewish. So now, in 1943, it also looked like the war was perhaps being lost by the Germans. There was North Africa, there was Italy, and there was Russia. The Germans had spread themselves too thinly. And some Germans could actually see that there was a possibility that the 1,000-year Reich wasn't going to survive. And so Mr. Best, who was the military head of the German occupation in Denmark, he suggested to Hitler that they should round up the Jews. Meanwhile, there was a counter-movement going on that they should not round up the Jews. And two messages somehow missed each other in Germany, and it was decided that yes, they were going to round up the Jews. And they sent a troop ship with room for 5,000 people, that was us, to Denmark. And it was in the harbor. And when all this became known, there was a man who was called Mr. Duckwitz, and I've got a picture of him here. He was rather a remarkable man. He was in the naval attaché to the German embassy, as it so was. And he decided this was a disaster. It must not happen. He did not want it to happen, and he wrote in his diary, "I know what I must do." Now, what he knew he must do was the same as a death sentence for him. And he decided he was going to the Danish authorities and tell them what was happening. So he went to the Danish, what was later on the Prime Minister, and told him. And then they went to the lay management of the Jewish community. And it was an old, venerable lawyer who had been there for years and years and years, and he knew exactly what was what. And when they came and told him, he said, "You're lying." But they were not lying. And the next day, in the shul, there was Erev Yontif, Erev Rosh Hashanah 43, it was announced that people would have to leave their homes now, lock the doors, not appear again, hide themselves somewhere. Where do you hide? Where do 7,000 people hide? And what happened?
Could you be identified as Jewish? Was there a marker in your
There
passport?
was no mark. You see, that was not it. We didn't have a mark.
Nothing in the passport. So you could assimilate and disappear. And
It's difficult to assimilate people. Just try it and go to screen. I mean, just try it. Or anywhere. Go to Nice and see whether you assimilate them or not in a hurry. You know, it's difficult. It's a process. How did 7,000 or 5,000 or 6,000 people, how did they hide in one go? The churches, funnily enough, were deeply involved. There was a pastoral letter was sent round to all the churches to be read out that week, that it was criminal what was happening, and it was their Christian duty to help and support and hide Jews. The university shut, and the students were sent out to find Jews wherever they could see them, because we are recognizable. Despite the fact that...
I don't see how, so I'd be inclined to...
You're quite right. I mean, I was recognized by a German SS officer as being Here sehen Sie ein typisch arisches Kind. Here you see a typically Aryan child. I was blonde in those days, but I still had blue eyes, okay? I mean, it's difficult to recognize. But anyway, people, how did people disappear? The students were sent out to find Jews. Somehow they found them. Where should they go? Churches, hospitals. The hospitals opened their doors, and Mr. Cohen became Mr. Hansen and suffered from some probably infectious illness, so he had to be put into isolation. And the whole thing happened incredibly quickly. Taxi chauffeurs drove around and looked. Could they see people who looked out of sorts? You know, the Mossad, people train their eyes, they do see things. Could they see people, and it went out like wildfire. It was really, it was what they nowadays call a root, what's it called?
Grassroots.
It came at grassroots. It was from the top and from the grassroots. In Denmark, people live in tall buildings, or fairly tall buildings, and they have very often, they're quite squashed together, and they very often have little summer houses outside in the countryside. And people went round with their keys, and wherever they saw people that they thought might want them, they just gave them their keys, gave them the address, and told them to go. This was a general thing in Denmark. And it's, you know, I feel very, very lucky to be able to tell you this story. Okay, so in no time at all, the next day, the Gestapo, they had to import extra Gestapo. The German military bits did not want to chase Jews. They said they were here to fight a war, not to look after older women and children. And so they imported some Gestapo, and there weren't enough of them. And the whole atmosphere was against them. The police was helpful. Everybody who in other countries helped to round up Jews didn't. And that was it. And so there were fishing boats. Now, Sweden is quite close to Denmark. There's a very narrow strait between them. We could actually, on clear days, we could see Sweden, but it's quite a busy strait, and there are lots of waves there. And you had fishing boats, and they filled up fishing boat after fishing boat, rowing boats, any method. You travel down the coast or up the coast and find a place, and there were fishing boats. And the fishing boats actually charged for it because A, they were losing their fish, and they also didn't know what the result would be, because in Norway, which was equally occupied, people suffered the death penalty for helping Jews. So it was, people really didn't know. So what about my parents? So here was my father, 5 children, the youngest was 6 months. So 6 months to 14 years, where could he possibly hide us? A 6-month baby cries and makes a noise, and it's dangerous to have around. So he went to somebody who was he had seen an envelope, and one of his business colleagues, by this time he was working, which said something about the Lord of the Manor. So he went to him and said, could we perhaps hide in one of his barns? And Mr. Alsing, who was the director of, if you imagine a small version of Harrods or something like that, which was a Danish version, picked up his phone, phoned his wife and said, can we take 7 extra people tonight? At the other end it came, of course. That was it. And my father went home, and my mother came into my room and said, up. I said, but I'm ill. I was in bed with a cold, I think. She said, up. And I had to dress. She said, we have to leave today, now. Oops. So she gave me 3 vests, 6 pairs of knickers, a skirt, a blouse, a dress, and a coat, I think. I was well padded. This was October, okay. And then she put things in our pockets. She put funny things in our pockets. A comb, toilet paper, soap. And she said very weird things. She said, when you arrive, you can exchange it for food. What was she talking about? We had no idea. And so our family split in 3 bits. I went with my father, my little sister on the train. We traveled for half an hour and got out. By now I got the gist of what was happening. I said, not here. It's much too near town. Much too near. And he said, no, 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 it's here. So we walked on. There was no barn, there was no manor. It was a normal 4-bedroomed villa. And the Alsings had 3 teenage daughters which had been sent away to the neighbors. And they incorporated the family beer that came with the pram, with the roast beef in the pram, and the challahs, and the little baby sleeping on top. And then they heard about these very weird dietary requirements my mother had about boiled vegetables and know this and know that. And she said, yes, 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 yes. And we stayed there for the next 10 days. After about a week, my parents felt it was too much for them and there were too many people in the house and perhaps it was dangerous. So they decided at night to go and leave together with my 2 big brothers. And they went to a nearby village where we had been in the summer for summer holidays, and next to us there was a little, there was a couple, and he was a taxi chauffeur. And she knocked on the window, and she said, Mr. Christensen, and out of his sleep he said, Mrs. Beer. And he padded out in his socks, went to the door, opened the door, and took in 4 strangers and kept them there for the next 3 days. After we had arrived, I'll just intersperse this with the feeling of Denmark. After we had arrived safely in Sweden, Mr. Alsing, who had money, went to Mr. Christensen and put 500 krona, which is like 500 pounds, say, on the table and said, thank you for your trouble. And Mr. Christensen pushed it away and said, oh no, that would take all my pleasure away. And that was sort of the general feel, okay? So, so we were hidden, and then I went with Mr. Alsing in a car with my little sister and brother who had been nicely sedated, not to squeak out of them. We went along a lot of dark roads, villa roads, and then in the dark woods. We went south quite a long way, and then eventually we ended up at a little beach. And down there was my father and a rowing boat. There was a bit of moonshine, and we got into the rowing boat and sailed out to a much bigger boat, which was anchored outside, a little further out in deeper waters. And there was a fishing boat, and it was absolutely chock-a-block with people. They just stood like in an underground, like that, stuck next to each other. And we must have been one of the last to come, and there was no room anywhere for us. And then my father showed me a little piece of deck, about, I suppose, 30 centimeters, and a railing. Hold on here, don't move. And I looked down the water, it was clacking very nicely down, quite a long way down. And I thought, and if I fall in, I'm not allowed to cry. I'm not allowed to shout. I just have to drown really quietly. I said, I'm not staying here. He said, okay. He was used to me by now. And he said, go down in the hold. So I went down in the hold, and I stood actually squashed against a nice lady. She was lovely, she was fat, she was warm, she was cozy. It was cold. It was good. So I stood there, and the ship starts going, 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 and goes on for hours and hours and hours. And everyone just stood very quietly. Nobody ever spoke. And this went on for hours and hours. And I was very tense. I must say, I was very tense indeed. And then suddenly, there was a flash from the sky, at least that's how it felt. And there was a roar from this boat. And I got a terrible shock. I said, what is it? What is it? There was this enormous roar. And I actually saw it like a flash from the sky opened up. I turned around to her and I said, what is it? What is it? And she said, we're singing. I said, singing? She said, singing. I said, singing? She goes, yes, they're singing the national Swedish song. We're in Swedish water, we're safe. That was it. And then we landed, and towards us jumped some grey uniformed soldiers, and I thought, so we were betrayed after all, but they were not. They were Swedish soldiers, and they were just in the same type uniform as the German ones. And We landed, we were put into some sort of refugee center. I suppose it was in school or something, lots of mattresses everywhere. And the grown-ups, this was 10 days after Rosh Hashanah, the grown-ups were still fasting. It was Yom Kippur. But the children got nice Swedish pancakes. They're very thick pancakes with jam on top and cocoa to drink, which wasn't bad at all. And that was it. And now we were in Sweden. So here were my parents, again, second time refugees, and this time with nothing at all, not even a suitcase with them. So we went to Stockholm and we lived in a disused office where there was nothing. Some refugee help must have come along and given us with various bits and pieces and beds and stuff. And my mother, once more, without maids, without nannies, without cooks, she had to reinvent us. So the boys were sent to school. They were big. They were 13 and 14. They were sent to school, and I was promoted. Now I was a nanny. So I took my little sister and brother walking up and down the pavement outside, 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the afternoon, to give my mother a chance to get something going. And then after a few months of that, she looks at me and she says, eigentlich musste Ruth doch auch in die Schule. Really and truly, Ruth also ought to go to school. So I was sent off to school. By now I was nearly 8. So I was sent off to a Swedish school and had a very, very nice teacher and very nice friends. It was fine. And then one day I had a sore throat. And I said to my mother, I've got a sore throat and I don't feel well at all. And she said, and I said, lots of kids in the class have got measles. She said, Ruth, why didn't you tell me? I said, I didn't know. Why didn't I tell her? Anyway, I got measles. The 2 little ones got measles. It was just before Pesach, and my mother was sitting there with my little brother, who was now nearly a year, who howled incessantly unless she was singing to him and holding him, going up and down like that, and it was nearly Pesach. And nonetheless, with all that, she managed to make Pesach. She even taught me the Manish Tana, which she carefully translated from Hebrew to German, which was her native tongue. And I learned it very nicely, all by heart, very good, so I could say it all. And then I turned around to her and I said, what does it actually mean? She said, but you just translated it. I said, did I? I didn't understand the German, didn't understand the Hebrew, and to this day I still have a problem. Okay, so there we were in Sweden, and it was really all right. We had no money, which didn't matter. I had no shoes. I had one pair of shoes, and they actually, eventually, the upper left the lower, and it curled over, and then I walked to school in this shoe. I did a special walk. You throw your foot forward, so the sole goes forward, and then you slap it down before it curls up underneath you. And it was the Swedish slush, and it was all right. We were together. You know, there wasn't really a problem. And I now fast forward to 1945, May, and the headlines were this big in the kiosk. The war's over, Hitler is dead, go away. The war's over, the war's over, fantastic. A few weeks later, my maiden name is Beer, and we were sent back to Denmark alphabetically. So we were some of the first people to go, and I was standing on the ship, thinking, this is the happiest day of my life. I'm going back to Denmark, war's over, it's finished. And I thought, when I grow up, I'm going to have lots and lots of children, and I'm going to tell them what I know now, which I've learned, which is you can go anywhere in the world and still be a good Jew. And I've been very blessed. I managed to do that. I had lots and lots of children, and I told them what I know now. So we came home. Now, in other countries, the houses were raised. There was nothing left. Somebody else lived in their house. Our house stood as we had left it. Before we left...
Your house in Denmark?
Our house in Denmark, our flat in Denmark. Before we had left, just a few weeks earlier, my father gave me a very nice backpack, which had brown foalskin on it, which you could sort of stroke in both directions. It was the most beautiful backpack anyone had. Certainly nobody in my class had anything like it. And I had left it in the corner of the room. And when I left, I said, bye-bye backpack, bye-bye room, and left. And when I came back, the backpack was exactly where I'd left it. And in the kitchen there was a big cake saying, from the lady in the dairy saying, "Welcome back." Yeah, woe is right. Woe is right. So as far as so I thought, right, war's over, that's it. At the same time, I think that, you know, if the Danes hadn't been what they were, and the Alsing hadn't been what they were, and the Christensens hadn't been what they were, and if my parents hadn't been as smart as they were, and HaKadosh Baruch hadn't looked after us, then I wouldn't be telling you this story now. But what I wish all of you, especially the young ones now, when you see the headlines about the terrible things that are happening and how awful everything is, and there's no way out, and we can't see a future nobody can see a future at the moment. We're all worried whether barbarians are coming back or whether we're all going to live by Sharia law eventually or something. I wish you that in due course you can tell a story to your kids. That's it.
Amen.
You asked some very sensible questions, but you have more.
Let me just say,
Yeah,
I just
so
want to
now
say
let the others.
thank you very much to Mr. Vecht. When we
It's a story, it isn't me. Yeah.
when we were considering the timing and the program, I said it would be lovely to have minutes left over for questions, which you said you're very happy to give
If
such
you
an
have questions,
opportunity.
yeah.
And I would like to, again, and particularly if there are any, well, anyone here really, but again, especially the younger, you know, members of the audience who would like to have a chance to ask or to interact with Mrs. Vecht, this is an opportunity. Can I just ask, what happened to this gentleman?
He was very honored by the Jewish community, and he had a good life after that. He had a good life after that. But the interesting thing is the pastoral letter from the bishop that was read in every church that week. And in Toulouse, a friend of mine went to the Bishop of Toulouse. She was hidden in France. And she said, "Do something for the Jews." And he wrote a pastoral letter to his people. And thousands of Jews were saved that way.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Remarkable. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ruthie.
Okay.
Rebbitzin privilege.
Rebbitzin.
Yeah, Rebbitzin.
Let me hear what you ask.
With all the upheaval that you went through, and your parents, and even being on the boat on Yom Kippur, and your parents were fasting and leaving and having to break Shabbos, how did your parents instill in you a love and a continuity of Judaism?
By doing, not by preaching. Just by doing, by being. We had in our house, my son and I was going to laugh. We had in our house a very big painting of a bacchanalia, which is a wine feast with very scantily clad ladies and little cherubs floating above, right? And we sat on the sofa. My father didn't go to shul Friday night. We sat on the sofa every Friday night underneath this table with all the wonderful little cherubs and the naked ladies, and sang L'Chodadi together. We didn't, just by doing, we kept strictly kosher, right? I learned to read every ingredient on everything from then, and that's quite a useful thing to do. I didn't have, as a child, I didn't have anybody I could go to on Shabbos and eat and play with. I had non-Jewish friends, but it was just, they lived it. We just knew that was the way to live. We lived really in a sort of little, Austrittsgemeinde community by ourselves. I had to play Ludo with my sister every Shabbos afternoon. It was so boring, I can't tell you. But, you know, we lived it. They didn't preach to us. My brother taught me at some stage, they said, "Oh, Ruth needs to learn Hebrew." So my brother said, this is bad, you know. So my brother sat on his iron bed with an exercise book and a yellow pencil and showed me how the Hebrew letters went, and then he wrote Danish words with them. That was a marvelous start at 8, right, okay. And then we came back to Denmark, and there was full occupation at the time, and the only people who really couldn't get a job were teaching in Cheder, I think. and it wasn't a great experience. Okay, but they just lived it. That's it.
Yeah, Dr. Schmidt.
Thank you so much for your account. You lived in so many different countries. You were born in Denmark with German parents, and then in Sweden, and now you live here. What is your identity, if I may ask?
I'm just me.
Are you a Danish Jew? Are you an English Jew? Are you just a Jew?
I'm just a Jew, really. But I feel at home.
Because I see, I was born in Vienna, so I came here.
Yeah,
after the war,
okay.
obviously.
No, I
So-
feel.
So because you speak
right.
perfect German, I hear from your accent. and
I
stuff.
speak good German,
Yes,
and
you
I
probably speak
love
Danish
German, and I
Swedish.
love German literature, and I read German poetry. Yeah, and where do I feel at home? Wherever I have a bed, I feel at home. Okay, it's simple.
Thank you.
Yes, Stephen.
So you were in Sweden
Yeah.
during the war, but Sweden was neutral, wasn't it, during the war?
Sweden was
How did
neutral.
that pan out?
It sold weapons to both the Allies and the Germans. Yes, it was
Did
neutral.
that make you more safe or less safe? How did that work? I mean,
They had agreed to take the Jews. They had agreed to take. There was a previous agreement. They were taking the Jews in. Yes, it was neutral, but it was also benefiting to a certain extent, like many neutral countries do.
Your father said, came back on a Friday, and he said, "We're going today."
Yeah, they
When
were
do we-
Machal Shabbos.
When do we reach that stage? That's for Shalom here.
Do I look like a prophetess? No.
But you might be as wise as your
Would-
father.
You know, there's a saying.
When should we realize? Chas v'shalom, I mean, I'm saying God forbid, but what would you say? Would your father say the signs would be?
I don't know. My husband died a year ago, and I'm supposed to clear up his study. But what happens is I start reading what's there, so the study isn't getting cleared up. But I read a very clever sentence by a philosopher from 1790, which said, "The price of liberty is eternal vigilance." And that's a good one. But I'm not a prophetess, no.
No, always
Might
not.
I ask one short question? I came this evening fascinated, enthusiastic about your story, and I had anticipated that the Danish sort of evacuation would have been, sort of the catalyst would have been financial gain for the Danish non-Jewish people. But your evidence, your testimony, is contrary to that.
Completely.
So I wanted to ask you, what would you say is the difference between the Danish people and the German people, that there is such a difference in balance? You previously alluded to the Danes being Christian, but the Germans are also, they're very
The
Christian.
Germans are also Christian.
In fact,
The
even
Danes,
also.
let me just say it like this. First of all, Denmark is a small country.
Yes, I'm aware.
At
8
that
million
time,
people.
okay, let me just say it like this. Danish is, I can't give you real clever reasons, right? Denmark is a small country and it's Lutheran, it's not Catholic. There's a certain coolness about being Lutheran, which is not there. The Catholics are more, they listen to the priest.
I don't know the difference between that. Okay, so there is a difference.
There is a
in,
difference, I would say there is a difference.
I see.
But
Because they
there
have
were
as many churches in each Gemeinde as Danes. They beautify them. They give charity to their churches.
Come on, they
They
leave.
light candles in the churches. They kind of, they are not atheists. It's not the Wild West. The
Which
Germans.
ones are you talking about? Sorry.
In fact, both. But I would have been inclined to say that the Germans are more fearful of
I would
God
say
and
the German
Christianity.
women are probably more religious.
Exactly.
The women are quite religious.
And the men also. No?
This depends which day.
In any event.
Yeah, but the Danes, it's not that they were religious, that they went to church every Sunday. Absolutely not.
Voilà.
And they're very free and easy. They love one another to an extent that is sometimes frowned upon. But they have a Christian morality, an awe of
Morality.
God,
Yes.
of actually that God means you to be a decent person. And that doesn't go with barbarity.
Yes.
And the other thing is that Denmark was a very small country and with a very homogeneous population. You know, when you sort of looked at the sea of, there was one girl in our class who had brown eyes.
Yes.
She was considered a beauty
Right.
because she had brown eyes. The rest of us all had blue eyes, right? It was a very homogeneous community. and there was a deep Christian feeling about it, not expressed in church going or anything like that.
Thank you, I'm grateful.
Yeah.
Did you end up staying then in Denmark after the war?
Yes, we came
Yeah,
back
you-
to Denmark. Yes,
you-
we
you
came
went-
back to Denmark.
Denise is asking if Mrs. Vecht stayed in Denmark after the war. She
My
had
pa-
this
my
homecoming.
parents- yeah.
Did you stay?
My parents stayed in the house where I was born, and they stayed there till they died. Right? I came to England as an au pair girl. I wanted to see the world, and I came to England to my father's absolute horror. I wanted to be an au pair girl, and he said, "I've never seen your great interest in housework." And I said, "That's absolutely true, but I want to go to England." So I put an ad in the Jewish Chronicle saying, "I want to be an au pair girl, and I want an Orthodox family, and I don't want any money." I got lots of letters.
I'm not surprised.
And I had a brilliant year.
And your parents never went back to Germany after the war?
No, they went once. They went once to find my uncle Eduard, who had survived in Berlin. And I mean, they went back a few times for generally, you know, to go to Bate Oram, but not to stay or anything like that.
Yeah. Did they ever get their property?
Sorry?
So what they left behind, did they ever get anything
Yes, at that time you could still send all your stuff to Denmark. So we got all the nice, heavy furniture back in the flats. Wonderful. That's it. Any questions? Are you? They all know what there is to know.
Well, you edified people to such an extent that you've anticipated all their questions.
Right, very good. Okay. done.
Okay, thank you again.
Where
We have more questions from
Where did the
Jack.
rest of your siblings go? Did they stay in Denmark or did they all go to different
Well,
countries?
like all Jews, we spread ourselves. One brother went to live in Sweden. The rest of them stayed in Denmark. My sister went to Israel. I went to England, and my husband got me, and which was very nice. I'm very pleased with that. And what else? And the others stayed in Denmark. Yeah.
And how did, so you told us that 5,000 or 6,000 Jews within a few days were absorbed into the community. How did the Germans react to that? What,
Oh, I'll tell you how Hitler reacted. Hitler heard that Denmark was Judenrein, free of Jews. But when he heard how it had happened, he had one of his hysterical attacks. I mean, in those days, I don't know whether it's true, we used to say he used to bite the carpet. It's possible he did, I don't know what he did.
I have a last question.
Yeah?
Is this rumor or this rumor that some Danish Jews are called Christian because of the king, because the king protected the Jews? Is that true? Was the king called Christian, by the way?
First of all, the king was called Christian. I don't know.
I heard the story once.
That people call their children Christian?
I heard the story.
Everything is
Someone called
possible.
it because, like Alexander, right? The sibling
Well,
called
Alexander
him.
was quite and people call their children Helen. We've got a Helen because she was the mother of Alexander.
But you don't know the story. You haven't
I
heard
don't know the story, but you have to be lucky because nobody's called their child Bucephalos, which was Alexander's horse. Do you remember that bit?
Okay.
So we're lucky.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vecht. We wish you many more years of productivity, of vigor, of good humor, and may you edify other audiences with all of
Thank
your
you.
wisdom.
Thank you. Wisdom.
Well done.